welcome to the very first episode of the Brute Norse podcast. My name is Eirik Storsund, and I'm an Old Norse philologist. If you have no idea what that is, it basically means that I study Vikings and medieval Scandinavian culture and religion, mainly through the textual sources. You may be familiar with the Icelandic sagas, the Eddic poems, and the colorful myths of the Norse gods, but there is so much more. There are literally hundreds of Norse texts, most of which are entirely overlooked in public discourse, and many have never even been translated at all. There are enough sagas, poetry, law codes, genealogies, scientific treatises, letters, and runic inscriptions in Old Norse to keep you busy for a lifetime. Additionally, there is so much exciting research going on that never reaches the masses. I cannot bring it all to you, but I can present case studies and the many strange, funny, and inspiring stories that are otherwise untold outside of dusty university conference rooms. As such, the object of Brute Norse is to shine a different light on Vikings and Norse culture and to bridge the gap between public and academia, though perhaps filtered through my personal love of all things that are strange and mysterious. Today we have an interview with Leszek Gardeła. He is a Polish archaeologist and assistant professor with the University of Rzeszów. He also boasts an impressive publication list containing several books and dozens of articles, specializing in strange mortuary practices and the ambivalence of magic and ritual. I had the pleasure of seeing him talk at the University of Bergen recently on the subject of death and ambiguity in the Viking Age. He agreed to join me for some park bench musings on magic, ethics, and the archaeology of emotion. So without further ado, here comes the interview. I've got a special guest here, Leszek Gardeła. He's an assistant professor at Rzeszów, a university in Poland. And perhaps you can introduce yourself.
I'm an archaeologist by profession, but I've had a profound interest in Old Norse religion and Old Norse mythology and ritual practices, and also in Old Norse literature. So my main line of research is trying to combine textual sources in archaeology and try to explore essentially the Viking mind, as some scholars would call it.
Yes, I think it's, looking at your CV, there's an impressive amount of literature that is, to call it interdisciplinary would almost be an understatement. And it's very interesting to me that it seems to touch upon a lot of what I like to call like the numinous. You sometimes discuss an archaeology of emotion, I think, in your early works, maybe. Would you mind elaborating on that, perhaps, a little?
Yeah, I have used this term archaeology of emotions because I like to try to get into people's heads, into the heads of people from the past by studying what is left of them, by studying objects, by studying burials, by studying preserved texts, and by combining these different sources, of course, always in a critical way. I believe it is possible to learn quite a lot about the emotions of those people, about their feelings, their beliefs, their everyday life, their idea about death and afterlife, about many different things.
Quite recently you finished a PhD about magical staffs, and I don't know if listeners are aware of this, but there have been a lot of discussion regarding a specific kind of object found in many female burials, a lot of them from Norway, but they're found all over Scandinavia, not on Iceland, I understand, but they might be associated with a specific ritual specialist called the vulva, and may be used in association with the magical act of seidr.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I finished my PhD in 2012. I did it at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Aberdeen, and my supervisor, Professor Neil Price, was actually the one who started looking at magic practices in the Viking Age, trying to combine both textual sources and archaeology, and my work builds upon his very important research. Although my focus specifically in this PhD thesis was on the one hand, on the objects that I call magic staffs, whereas on the other hand, I also looked at a number of very strange graves and funerary practices that some archaeologists call deviant burials or atypical burials. So just last year, I published a revised version of part of my PhD thesis, which concerns objects that I call magic staffs, and they're very fascinating finds. And to most people, the term magic staff would immediately bring associations with Harry Potter and fairies and magicians and wizards and children's tales. But if you treat the topic more seriously, it appears that the magic staff, the idea of the magic staff, is a very old, very ancient idea, and that the first examples of staffs used for ritual purposes can be found already in the Stone Age.
Yeah, like that's a recurring theme when we're talking about magic in today's society, that it's looked upon as something foolish, superstitious. But these people lived in magical worldviews where this permeated their view of reality.
Yeah, it was part of their reality, and they did not distinguish between this world and the other world, and all these different realities, so to say, were overlapping.
Yeah, it was no joke. We only have to look at many societies today where this is a facet of reality that is treated with utmost respect.
To them, magic was real, and it was something that could be effectively used to different ends, really, for positive things, for negative things, for ambivalent things. And we find tangible traces of these different beliefs and practices in the archaeological record. And as an archaeologist, I'm very interested in exploring this evidence and also trying to better understand it, I guess.
So these magical staffs, what are their funerary contexts, and what do they look like?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the first thing we should say is that about 40 finds that could be labeled as magic staffs are known from Viking Age archaeology, and they are usually found, as you said, in so-called funerary contexts, that is, in graves. And the graves are scattered all around the Viking world, but most of the graves with staffs actually come from Norway. And today we are sitting in Bergen, and just a couple of 100 meters from here is the University Museum, which has actually the largest archaeological collection of objects that can be interpreted quite plausibly as magic staffs. But in the Viking Age, they had many purposes. They were used for various acts and various rituals, and they were also buried at the end of their use. Probably with their original users in different kinds of graves. There are essentially two categories of graves that can be distinguished in the Viking Age. The first one are so-called cremation graves, that is, graves of people who were burnt. Their cremated remains are placed in one way or another in the ground. And in these graves we also find magic staffs, but also inhumation graves, that is, graves where people are buried unburned. So the whole body is placed inside the grave pit or in a chamber, sometimes on a boat, in all sorts of ways. And again, these objects interpreted as magic staffs are found in graves of this type. But I guess you would ask, what do the magic staffs look like? What are their material forms? They come in various forms, and they come in various shapes and sizes. Generally, you can distinguish two sort of basic types. There are staffs made of iron, and there are staffs made of wood. The iron examples are the sort of most exciting ones for the modern eye. They are often beautifully decorated. They have copper alloy knobs. They sometimes have animal shaped decoration. So they were definitely very difficult objects to produce in the first place, probably quite expensive, and also endowed with very rich symbolism. They referred to a lot of ideas and concepts within the Viking mind and the Viking world.
Well, you briefly touched upon the fact that these have some association with what we call deviant burials.
Yes, the term deviant burial essentially refers to a form of treating the dead that is unusual. So some of the staffs have been found in graves that are in one way or another different from what is found in a particular cemetery at a particular time at a particular spot. And my studies of staffs and graves with staffs have actually led me to a new strand of my research that is on other variants of unusual, uncommon, rare types of graves. And I have looked at cases that are quite bizarre or odd. So, for example, cases when people are buried with large stones placed over their bodies, or cases when there's a body that is lacking the head, or cases when an individual is buried on their belly, face down. And I have spent quite a lot of time trying to first gather a corpus of all these different graves to understand how they differ across space and time, but also to interpret what could they mean. Why would you decapitate someone, or why would you place a large stone over a dead person, or why would you bury someone facing the ground?
Yeah, some of these are really fascinating, and they get really morbid. I think I can quote Neil Price when I met him at a conference a few years ago, and we discussed this, creepy feeling you get when you work with these burials, and he would not want to travel back to that area. It would be very shocking to most of us. And that's, I think, in an age where part of, when we discuss Vikings, especially in terms of contemporary identity, you want, and that's also a scholarly issue, I think, that people want to associate themselves with, especially in Norway, where it's a question of ancestry. You don't want them to have qualities maybe that you do not want to be associated with.
I fully agree with Neil Price and with his claim that some things that happened in the Viking Age would have been strange for us today, or creepy. And indeed, some of those graves are creepy by modern standards. But they are also very interesting. And when we explore them as archaeologists or as textual scholars, we can actually learn, by examining them carefully, learn a lot about the society that sort of produced them. You asked if I have my favorites. I don't know if this is the right word, but there are certainly some examples that are very interesting and that have been puzzling me for quite some time. I guess one example that has also become quite known in archaeology, but also in popular culture, because I collaborate with an artist who has created a beautiful artistic reconstruction of this grave at the time of burial. It's a grave that was found a couple of years ago in Denmark, at a place called Trekroner Grydehøy, which is in Zealand, not so far from Roskilde. It was one of the richest graves in this cemetery, and what happened was that the local community, they dug a pretty deep and wide burial pit, and they buried a woman who was an adult at the time of death. Around her, they placed all sorts of objects, a chest and a bucket, but also in the course of the funeral, they slaughtered animals. And it's not uncommon to slaughter animals during funerals, but the way they did it here was quite unusual. One of the animals was a dog, and the dog was cut in half, bisected, and laid at the woman's feet. They also slaughtered a horse, and they placed this horse in the grave in such a way that part of the horse's body covered the body of that woman. One of the most striking aspects of this grave was yet another object placed by her side, which was an object that looks very much like a little arrowhead or a spearhead. It is made of copper alloy, but it has an iron tip at the end. It probably had a wooden shaft, so it looked very much like a little arrow, or I would argue something like even a magic staff, implying that perhaps this woman had something to do with magic. But this was not the end of the funeral, and the things that happened after laying the horse over her body were quite dramatic by today's standards. So the people responsible for the funeral, they brought very large stones, which they then threw or laid over the woman's body and over the horse, essentially crushing everything that was in the grave. And then, the way I imagine it, this group of people gathered around the grave, took stones and started throwing little stones and pebbles inside the grave, filling it up, until they finally filled it with soil. So in a sense, you could argue that they performed some kind of act of post-mortem stoning. And this is interesting when we look at it from the perspective of literary, textual accounts, Old Norse sagas, because in quite a few sagas of the Icelanders, written in Old Norse, there are accounts of sorcerers who are performing this malevolent magic, seidr, as you mentioned earlier. And one of the ways of dealing with them and punishing them for performing this magic was actually by stoning them to death, which was often followed by also placing stones over their bodies and burying these people in isolated liminal locations like mountain ridges or beaches and so on.
It sounds very extreme to us, but these people were treated with, it seems, as much respect as suspicion.
Yes, yeah. There is certainly a sense of ambivalence, and my doctoral thesis from Aberdeen from 2012 had this word ambivalence in the title. And as you say, on the one hand, these ritual specialists, they were respected and needed, essential in the society. People would ask them for advice, for help, but at the same time they aroused a sense of fear, and people may have felt uncomfortable in their presence in different ways.
Do you have any cross-cultural parallels to this?
Yes, of course. There's quite a few cross-cultural parallels, and we can look at other ritual specialists in other cultures, and we often find them to be perceived in the same kind of ambivalent way, both revered and sort of hated at the same time. A lot of shamans in traditional societies were also perceived in this way. So yes, this is of course, this Viking magic is part of a much bigger, broader picture.
Well, yeah, you've one thing that I've noticed a lot with your publications is the elaborate use of illustrations and reconstruction drawings. When I was studying, and actually before I started studying, I did Viking reenactment and stuff like that, and it was so hard to get hold of proper materials that showed line drawings of artifacts, and I also lacked an artist's eye depicting and making this stuff alive. But now this has become so much more easy, just with your work. Do you want to say something about the the benefits of this
Sure.
in your work?
I use a lot of art or visual art. I have been collaborating for quite some time now with a Polish artist whose name is Mirosław Kuźma. He's an illustrator, a very talented man. And what we are doing in our collaborative work, we are trying to create artistic reconstructions of graves as they may have appeared at the time of burial, using available archaeological evidence. So we refer to published information about particular graves. So we take into consideration the plan of the grave, the position of the body, the arrangement of objects around the body, the objects themselves, and we sort of, if it's a inhumation grave or where there's a skeleton preserved, we sort of try to flesh the bones and dress them and try to recreate what it may have appeared the grave at the time of burial. And it's a difficult process. It takes quite some time to create a reconstruction like this. You also have to be very careful. A lot of questions arise because it is often the case that we don't know what the person buried in a particular grave looked like. We are not always able to reconstruct, for example, the face or the hairstyle or the clothing. These are things that are unavailable, inaccessible to us because of matters of preservation. So we kind of have to imagine them in one way or another. And there is a lot of licentia poetica or artistic license in these reconstructions, but we try to be as careful and as precise as we can. We have made a reconstruction of this Danish grave that I talked about earlier, and this involved visiting the museum in Roskilde, talking to its original excavator, Dr. Jens Ulrichsen from that museum. He took us to the site. He discussed the results of his work because it is from his excavations. He showed us the finds from the grave, and all this ensured that this reconstruction now is probably one of the most careful, most precise reconstructions that we have made so far.
That's an amazingly elaborate process. It's much more than you would originally think when you see the drawing. It's these. I'll probably try to, if I may, add some in the show notes and definitely provide some links.
No problem.
But these are really great, and I think that they open new doors to a lot of people educationally.
Yes, I use them in my lectures. I use them in my articles. They definitely, one thing that they help to see is they help to illustrate the uniqueness of a certain grave, of a certain burial practice. Even though, as I said, we have to sort of imagine their physical appearance, the physical appearance of the dead, we add a certain sense of identity and a sense of uniqueness and individuality to these people. And in a way, through these illustrations, we can tell something about their lives. We can tell or retell, recreate their stories, something about their life and something about their death as well.
It's very humanizing, I think. It's something completely different than seeing just skeletons and seeing human remains. In that
of course, we are also aware of all sorts of ethical issues that these reconstructions evoke. On the one hand, well, we are dealing with a sensitive topic because we are essentially reconstructing death, which is a very sensitive topic, and it was definitely a sensitive topic in the past as well. Maybe I often think about that. Maybe we shouldn't do it. Maybe these people should not be shown or exposed as they are in our reconstructions. But by doing that, we as archaeologists, as academics, are trying to tell their story and sort of remember them And for the people of the past, especially people of the Viking Age, this idea of remembrance, this lasting story, the name that is remembered for ages was very important. So perhaps in this way we are sort of paying back the debt for digging them up in the first place while conducting excavations.
Yeah, that's a huge philosophical issue in contemporary archaeology.
Yeah.
You know, the ethics of exhuming.
I think we have to be very respectful, and you don't see it often in archaeology. It's digging up graves and removing bones is part of the archaeological practice, but I think it's important to spare a thought when we do this, to think about the bones that we find were once part of a living, breathing human, and certainly in my work I try to, whenever I excavate graves or I deal with bones, I like to spare a thought and think about the individual. I think they deserve that, I think. And the same goes for objects buried with the dead, especially objects that must have been very personal, objects such as jewelry or amulets or magic staffs. These were certainly objects infused with meanings and emotions, objects that maybe the dead would not want anyone to touch, and yet we are touching them today. We are displaying them in museums. Modern reenactors are replicating them. It's a process that cannot be stopped, but it's something that should be debated, discussed, and sort of thought about in this ethical context.
I agree, and especially when I guess it applies to all such contexts, but especially when you're working with these so-called deviant burials, where you're talking about potentially people who are sometimes they might have been unwanted by society. You're talking about people who might have been abhorred, you know, and where the context appears extremely dramatic. But this is also, I think, it's very interesting in a wider, like I can kind of relate to this in a very bizarre way. I have a friend who gave me access. I had to sleep in a bed, you know, in a room in an attic once, and which an old lady had lived in, and presumably she had died there. And she left behind a lot of objects that were really strange and peculiar to see and behold, and I touched a few of them. You know, there were clothes there still. There was her, you know, dentures were still left behind, and pictures of loved ones. And these are things that people cherish. They are not items that people parade around. They are intimate objects, and though the specific memories elude us, it was very weird to handle these, you know. And I very much felt like this was an example of a contemporary archaeology, where I was in the presence of a story that I partly could attempt to reconstruct with objects that had belonged to a deceased person. Certainly a very strange place to sleep. I guess you have that in the sagas as well, people sleeping in burial chambers and whatnot. It wasn't as extreme, luckily, but yeah, I think maybe that concludes the interview. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for an interesting discussion.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this very first episode of the Brute Norse podcast. I may be the engine of BruteNorse.com, but you, my audience, is the fuel that keeps the engine running. If you like my content, you can help by sharing it or supporting me on Patreon. It's a monthly subscription, and you can donate as much or as little as you like. This allows me to cover production fees and enables me to create more varied and higher quality content. Otherwise, you can help me by providing feedback and comments. Brute Norse is nothing without you. Again, this is Eirik Storesund, and thank you for listening.